Final round, guys. Let's talk about World War II today. Let's talk about a brief history of the 20th century for the U.S. And let's finish this 8th grade year strong. Let's get right to it. Proud of you guys. Let's roll. So the question that always is asked is, when did World War II start? Well, in my opinion, it kind of started right here. Notice this is 1919. This is the Treaty of Versailles. This is the end of World War I. How does the end of World War I cause World War II to start? Well, it started like this. The treaty was too cruel to Germany. It basically gave Germany the bulk of the blame for World War I, and the punishments were geared towards Germany, even though the war started with an assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, who is not German. Germany was given the bulk of the blame because Germany did the bulk of the fighting, and ultimately Germany was the one who caused the most casualties on that side. So they were given the bulk of the blame. So the Treaty of Versailles, here are the four main punishments that really impacted Germany that were really, really cruel. First, they had to admit total blame for World War I, meaning they were the one who caused it. It wasn't an Archduke Ferdinand situation, it was Germany overreaching. Second, they were required to pay the total cost of World War I for all people involved. Even though there was other people involved fighting, Germany had to pay all the bills for it. It's kind of interesting. I read not too long ago, I think it was about 5 years ago, that Germany finally paid off its World War I debts, because that's a lot of money. 3, must limit size of army and navy, and they weren't allowed an air force. Basically, their country was completely weak and pathetic when it came to armed forces. Which in the eyes of the Allies was like, okay, to make sure that Germany doesn't start any trouble, they don't have an army to start that trouble. And 4, German colonies were divided amongst the Allies, so everything Germany owned besides in Germany was taken away from Germany and given to the Allies. It just depended where it was, who got what. This is very harsh to Germany, and it's going to be very bad for the German people. To put it in perspective, with all that debt, their currency is going to become basically useless. At the beginning of the 1920s, it was 163 marks for a loaf of bread, which is a lot of marks for a loaf of bread. Imagine if 1 mark equaled $1. By the end of the 1920s, it was 200 billion German marks for that price for a loaf of bread. So basically, their currency was worthless, and the people of Germany are suffering. And didn't help also that the Great Depression happened, which didn't just limit itself to the United States. This was a global depression. And the old saying goes, when the United States does poorly economically, like if the United States gets a cold in their economy, the rest of the world gets the flu. We do bad economically speaking, the rest of the world does infinitely worse. So unemployment, super bad. Currency, completely worthless. Germany doesn't have an army or navy, really. Doesn't even have an air force. They were looking for some type of hope. And they found it. Although, obviously, if you know who Adolf Hitler is, obviously it was a false hope. But you get the idea. An Austrian guy rose to power, and they elected him Adolf Hitler. He promised to make Germany great once again. And to the credit of Adolf Hitler, Germany will see huge improvements. Although to the discredit of Adolf Hitler, it came at the expense of exploiting a huge people group. More on that later. So, anywho, Adolf Hitler is made the Führer. How does World War II actually start, though, like the actual fighting? Well, Hitler is going to ultimately invade Poland. Basically, Hitler was doing this situation where he was trying to expand the borders of Germany once again and make Germany prominent again. So he rebuilt the army, rebuilt the navy, made an air force. He basically was defying the Treaty of Versailles, and then he was trying to get back the territory that was once Germany. And then they invaded Poland, which was kind of the last straw. Poland wasn't something that Germany ever owned. It was just simply Hitler being aggressive. So France and the UK declared war on Germany. And then after quite some time, the USSR and the US would join that side. But it will be after quite some time. So, World War II. The war to end all wars, which was World War I, was not the war to end all wars because we now have World War II. Due to the appeasing, the person in charge in Germany known as Hitler, Hitler regained the strength that he needed to wage war on Europe once again for Germany. This time, though, the Allies would have a much, much harder time with it. For a couple of reasons. You'll notice here with this picture, you'll see the Soviet Union and the US joined in 1941, meaning it's basically these guys versus these guys for a while, and it ain't going to go well for these guys here, the Allies. It goes really, really bad. Like, as in, Germany just expands all the way through to the point that eventually they conquer all of mainland Europe. They don't conquer the UK. They never set foot in the UK because it's an island. It's very difficult to invade an island. All you have to do is play defense and just surround yourself. And there's some really awesome commentary like the Battle of Britain. But long story short, Germany will never set foot in the UK, similar to how Napoleon was never able to do that either. It's very difficult to cross that English Channel. Um, Hitler even makes peace with Joseph Stalin, the USSR, to make sure he could invade that part of Europe very easily. Basically, him and Stalin were not friends, but they both had similar ambitions. Basically, Hitler was like, hey, I would love to have this. I would love to have Poland. Joseph Stalin was like, hey, I want Estonia and Latvia and Finland and all those other things. So basically, because both of them wanted to expand their territory, even though they didn't like each other, they stayed out of each other's way. But eventually, once they got that territory, they still did not like each other. So Germany will invade the USSR. Once Germany was done with France, because France falls very quickly and conquered all of Western Europe besides the UK, then it's like, all right, just move the tanks in the other direction. This time we will take out the USSR. Now, it should be noted that the USSR will survive, but it will come at a huge cost. Look at how many deaths Russia, the USSR, the Soviet Union has to deal with World War II. It's much more than anybody else. So they will hold off the Germans, but it will cost them dearly, as in a lot of people will die. But anywho, now during all this time, the US decided to stay basically neutral, similar to how it did in World War I. It's like, hey, that's a European problem, and we'll just sell guns to the people we like, so that way we make sure that they don't get conquered. And they just were perfectly content with doing that, until eventually Japan attacked us in Pearl Harbor. Japan was an ally of Germany, so once they had attacked Pearl Harbor, we were now at war with Japan, which means we were also at war with Germany. So when Pearl Harbor happened, that is when we get into World War II. Now, once we enter World War II, things start to look a little bit better for the Allies. At this point, Hitler had pretty much control of all of Europe, but the United States, with the help of the British and some French forces, are going to launch a massive invasion on D-Day to reconquer the western parts of Europe. Alternatively, or not alternatively, at the same time, the USSR, although a lot of people died defending the USSR, finally broke the German spirits, thankfully because of winter. So same thing that happened to Napoleon. The winter strikes again. And now they're starting to roll tanks over into the eastern parts of the Nazi Empire. And that's when it started to look better for the Allies. However, that's also when people started to realize what the Nazis had been doing while nobody else knew it was happening. People in the Nazi territory obviously knew it was happening, but the USSR did not know this was happening. The US did not know that this is happening. Had they known, they probably would have invaded a lot sooner, but Hitler kept this stuff secret. There was something going on that nobody knew about, and that was the Holocaust. Basically, Germany was rounding up Jewish people, taking them to concentration camps, and forcibly executing them in those concentration camps. 11 million people will die to the Holocaust. These were citizens, these were civilians, these were people who were just Jewish people who were being discriminated for being Jews. And long story short, they'll be executed for it, just simply because they were born Jewish. It was all part of Germany's scheme to try to make Germany great again. Adolf Hitler kept blaming the Jews, as in the Jews are the reason we're in this bad shape, economically speaking. And then used that propaganda to get people on board with trying to exterminate and eliminate the Jewish people. Like I said, 11 million people will die in the Holocaust. So basically it was the Russians finding out. They saw these people, these Jewish people, in these concentration camps, and it was not a good situation. Basically, if you've ever heard of stories like Anne Frank and stuff like that, it is a huge dark moment in history. But anywho, as the Allies were starting to invade Germany, they realized this was going on. Then eventually got to the point that Germany will indeed surrender, because if you look at the map right there, Germany's a whole lot smaller at that point because of the US, the UK, and the USSR invading, to the point that the Russians will get there first and they'll start bombarding Berlin, and the Germans will be forced to surrender. Adolf Hitler will commit suicide within a Nazi bunker. So that still leads a question, though, because most people think World War II ends when Adolf Hitler dies and then Germany loses. But there was a whole attack on the western side of the world known as Pearl Harbor that was still needed to be dealt with, as in Japan. And that's when the atomic bomb was dropped. It was codenamed the Manhattan Project, and long story short, the United States developed a weapon in pursuance because Germany was also developing this weapon. There's actually a really interesting story, if you ever want to hear it, about the lead German scientist literally sabotaging the atomic bomb efforts for Germany because he did not agree with Adolf Hitler. He's like, if Adolf Hitler gets this bomb, the world ends. And he literally sabotaged it. Germany probably should have gotten the atomic bomb before us. But we get the atomic bomb, and we use it on Japan to basically force them to surrender. It was kind of we either invade Japan and kill a lot more people, or we show Japan you stand no chance, and Japan surrenders. The emperor surrenders in Japan after the 2 atomic bombs are dropped, and World War II will end at that point. And that will usher in an era known as the Cold War. The thing with World War II is we were allied with USSR, which is a communist country. And we are a very much free market, freedom, capitalist country. Those are two opposites. But during World War II, it was the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We both did not like Hitler, so we joined forces to get rid of Hitler. But once Hitler was gone, the enemy of my enemy is still my enemy. And that leads to a period known as the Cold War. Now, the key word here is cold. If it was a hot war, we would have been actually doing a lot more fighting, but it was cold. It was a period of time where we just were under the impression that at any moment, World War III would start, because the US had atomic bombs, and the USSR just got them. So, Cold War happens. And during that time period, some things were pretty normal. I mean, technology and stuff still advanced. Like in the 1950s, the credit card was actually a thing, which I'm sure all of you guys know how to use, right? I mean, hopefully not. Oh man, the picture didn't show up. That's okay. If you don't know how a credit card works, basically you have a credit card, you borrow money from a credit card company, and then they give you that money to purchase a good, and you pay back that money over a period of time plus interest. Interest is money on top of what you owe. It's the reason why credit card companies will do it, because they're making money off of you. And that's, man, both of my big ones went bye-bye. And that's the same thing how interest works in like a savings account, by the way. That's the banks borrowing money from you, and then they're giving back that money to you plus interest. These are stuff that people prior to the 20th century couldn't even dream of doing, but now it changes the whole dynamics of the world. Maybe you couldn't afford a car before. Now with credit cards, you could, and then you just pay it off over time. It's a totally different ball game in this time period. Man, all 3 of them are gone. Well, hopefully they're there for when you guys see this PowerPoint. And side note, when it comes to those interest rates, if you're ever wondering how they choose that number, it just depends on how the economy is doing. If the economy is doing really, really well, the interest rate will be a little bit higher. If the economy is doing really, really bad, the interest rates will be lower, because they have to give you some incentive in order to borrow money. Like right now, the economy is doing really, really bad because of this COVID-19 situation. Interest rates are basically 0%. Not basically as in absolutely, it's just they're so low that it feels like 0%. So if you ever wondered how that works, there you go. Little life lesson for you real quick. Anywho, back to the timeline. The Korean War. So during this whole Cold War situation, it was a non-aggressive situation between the US and the USSR. The USSR was the communist country, we were the free country. And instead of fighting each other, we fought where communism was spreading. And that was why we got into like the Korean War. Basically, North Korea was a communist country invading South Korea, which was a free country. South Korea was our friend, so we helped out South Korea during that war. It basically was a draw, as in nobody gained any territory, nobody lost any territory, but at the end of the day, the biggest victory is South Korea still exists today and actually makes a lot of your like technology, like your TVs, your video games, all that different stuff. So if you Want to give a thumbs up for the US for involving in the Korean War? There you go. Vietnam, very similar situation. South Vietnam was a free country, North Vietnam was a communist country. We were trying to prevent the spread of communism, so we were helping out South Vietnam. Now, South Vietnam will lose this war, and that means ultimately we lose the Vietnam War. But it wasn't really the US's fault for losing this war. Basically, long story short, people in the US got really, really tired of fighting wars that wasn't necessarily involving them, and they were tired of people getting drafted for those wars and then ultimately being sent to a place to die in those wars, when it's not like it's necessarily super helping the US. So we leave Vietnam, and then the minute we leave Vietnam, North Vietnam just simply invades South Vietnam, and then the Vietnam War is over at that point. And South Vietnam is no more. It's one big Vietnam that's communist today. But you get the idea. During this Cold War, we're literally fighting where communism is spreading. Now, there was other things going on during this time period as well, like space stuff. It wasn't just actual fighting on like the ground. It was also like fighting in like outer space. Not fighting in outer space like Star Wars, but like getting to space first. And the USSR actually beats us to space. They sent out the first satellite ever to be launched into our orbit, known as Sputnik 1, which triggered a space race between the US and the USSR. Which, a space race? Yes. We were competing with the USSR to get to space first, and we lost the first round of it. They got to space before us. The real prize, though, was the moon. Ultimately, space was this new frontier of potentially having some huge military advantages. I mean, imagine like a Death Star, if the US owned a Death Star. That'd be pretty cool. Ronald Reagan would approve. But anywho, the Soviets also beat us again in the space race. They launched Sputnik 2, so they actually got to space first as far as the first satellite, and they also launched the first living creature in space, which was a doggy by the name of Laka, which was on stamps and stuff during the Soviet Union during this time. So we were losing bad in the space race, but we will ultimately win the space race with Apollo 11. So July 20th, 1969, after President Kennedy gave the famous order at the beginning of that decade that we would put a man on the moon, the United States did as such. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. We've been to the moon a total of 6 times, with 12 total different astronauts, between the years 1969 to 1972. No other country has ever been to the moon. Only the United States has. So as far as the space race is concerned, we may have lost the first couple of laps, but we ultimately win the grand prize of the moon. The only flags on the moon are US flags, because America. There are 2 kinds of countries in this world, ladies and gentlemen. Those who use the metric system and those who have landed on the moon, because we don't use the metric system. But anywho, then you have some other periods throughout the United States during this time period, like the Civil Rights Movement. Long story short, after the Civil War, as you saw with Reconstruction, the racism aspect was not fixed. Civil rights movement would be that push for it. This would be ending of segregated schools, ending of segregated buses, ending of segregated cars on trains, ending of various things, Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, a whole bunch of different stuff. It's why Martin Luther King Jr. is ultimately going to have a dream. The Civil Rights Act will be signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson July 2nd, 1964. So during the Vietnam War. Then you had stuff going a little bit over. I mean, again, this is brief, like the creation of the internet. A lot of people say, like, hey, when did the internet start? 1991. Now, truth be told, it actually started in the 60s, but like where you could actually access a computer and stuff, that was the 1990s. So not too far ago, as in like your parents probably remember that. And then our last thing we'll talk about, just to kind of give you a brief discussion of U.S. history, was when that Iron Curtain fell. The Iron Curtain was basically the Soviet Union. It was all the countries that were behind the curtain stuck in communism. Long story short, just like most communist countries, not most actually, all communist countries, they eventually fall apart. Basically, the Soviet Union went bankrupt because they kept redistributing the wealth, and eventually there just wasn't enough wealth to go around, and the curtain will eventually fall. The USSR will go bankrupt. You saw a lot of things throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, such as like Ronald Reagan, where he literally went to like West Berlin, because after World War II, Germany was divided in half, half for the USSR, half for the US. And he went to West Berlin basically saying, because the city was also divided in half, saying, hey, we should tear down this wall. No, Gorbachev, you tear down this wall. And in 1991, the Iron Curtain was gone. This whole Cold War had ended at that point. The USSR was gone at that point, and now all these countries were now liberated and could choose what they wanted to do. They could be free countries, they could be communist countries. Countries like Russia remained communist. Countries like Ukraine chose the freedom route very quickly. Same with like Czechoslovakia. It's no longer Czechoslovakia, it's called Czech Republic. And this was a huge turning point for the US history because now people aren't necessarily going underneath their desks preparing for an atomic bomb to be dropped on them. That's what the Cold War felt like. Instead, it's like our greatest enemy has basically vanished. I mean, Russia's still not our friend today, but they are not the strength of the USSR. Um, and that pretty much does it for at least getting you to where we are at in the 21st century. I'm sure you guys can fill in all the blanks, like the iPhone being created like in 2006 and stuff like that. But that about does it when it comes to this, guys. So I hope you guys are doing super well. If you want to do that timeline worksheet, by all means, it's on RenWeb for you guys. And I'll see you guys later.